It's a real pleasure to warmly welcome Harun. Harun, as I said, is a professor of economic and international development at Trent University. He's on the editorial board of the Canadian Journal of Development Research, of which he was the editor-in-chief, and he's also associate editor of Feminist Economics. He's an economist by training, and he's worked extensively over the years on agrarian change, political ecology, rural livelihood, and gender relations, as well as around food and land grab. And most recently, he's had a paper out on COVID-19 and world food systems. Harun has also been an advisor to a number of leading UN agencies, including UNDP and UN Women, advising them on issues around gender, women's empowerment, and livelihood issues. And in 2015, he was awarded Trent's Distinguished Researcher of the Year Award. So it's a great pleasure to have him here. He's published extremely widely, and most recently brought out the Handbook on Critical Agrarian Studies, which came out in 2021. You will find his papers in a range of journals, from Journal of Peasant Studies, World Development, Development and Change, EJDER, Canadian Journal of Development Studies, Feminist Economics, and Journal of Agrarian Change. Today, Harun is going to talk about understanding the contemporary food crisis, structural causes, and structural solutions. He's going to talk for about 45 to 50 minutes, and then we'll have at least half an hour for Q&A at the end. Is that all right?
Okay, right, now I can see that I can be seen. Good. Well, welcome everyone online and in person. I want to, of course, start by thanking Professor Shamal Azmat for the invitation to speak here today. I want to thank Rob for doing the logistics of all of this complexity. And to Khalid for chairing. It was quite remarkable when I started thinking about how long it's been since I've seen him as well. And I can't say how wonderful it is to actually be in a room and not on the screen. So all of you who are doing this over the screen, I really wish you were in the room, because there's nothing quite like the cut and the thrust of live seminars. I also want to say I'm really pleased to be here in Manchester, because in fact, this is my first time ever at GDI, which is really odd when I think about it. So this has been it's a real pleasure. Of course, I'm emphasizing, as Khalid has, the fact that this is a hybrid session, and that really does indicate the extent to which so many things have changed over the past 2 years. So much in the world has changed. And I want to really use that as my entry point today, because although the world's changed a lot in the past 2 years because of the pandemic, I would actually want to suggest that the world of the 21st century really is very different from that of the 20th century. And we live in what I would call new times. And I would call it that for 4 fundamental reasons. Firstly, there are significant demographic changes transpiring. In May 2007, the global population living in cities for the first time in human history became bigger than the global population living in the countryside. In October of 2011, world population moved beyond 7 billion, and now it's at 7.9 billion as we move towards the 8 billion mark. On the 24th of November last year, India's fertility rate fell below the replacement rate for the first time ever. And of course, China's fertility rate has been below the replacement rate for decades. And while it's true that, you know, India will have more people sometime than China sometime in the next 3 years, there really is significant demographic changes taking place. I was really shocked, for example, to read in the Financial Times this morning that the forecast life expectancy in the UK of men and women is going to decline, according to the Office of National Statistics, over the course of the next 20 years. And the world as a whole has reached something that you can call peak child. What I mean by that is that the number of children alive today in the world will be the same as the number of children alive at the end of the century. There'll be an increase over the course of the 2040s to 2050s, but by the end of the century, it'll be the same as it is now. The second fundamental change has been climate chaos. The last 8 years have been the hottest since the so-called Little Ice Age. And I really think it's worthwhile to think of the destruction that this causes. In 2020, I compiled a list for 2019, and it really is quite remarkable. 1 million hectares burned down in the Amazon, 2.5 million hectares in Siberia burned down, 11 million hectares in Australia burned down, and there were wildfires in California and in Canada, and millions of hectares around the world were partially ravaged by fires. In 2019, floods in Argentina and Uruguay forced 11,000 people from their homes, while flooding in Jakarta forced 400,000 people from their homes. Cyclones Idai and Fani, Storm Eberhard, Typhoons Faxi and Hagibis, and Hurricane Dorian killed thousands of people and displaced tens of thousands in Zimbabwe, Mozambique, Malawi, Bangladesh, India, Germany, Japan, the UK, the US, and Canada. And then there was drought in Australia, the US, and Eastern, Southern, and Western Africa. That list from 2019, the second hottest year on record, made it appear in 2020, when I compiled the list, that it was as if the 4 climactic horsemen of the apocalypse had rode into plain sight: floods, storms, droughts, and wildfires. And then things only worsened in 2021. But the climate catastrophe involves more than the 4 horsemen of extreme weather events, because we've seen rising land temperatures, rising ocean temperatures, and rising sea levels. And these are all interconnected, because rising temperatures create warmer air, which holds more moisture, which in turn makes storms more ferocious, even as it melts the ice at the poles, increases sea levels, and increases ocean temperatures. Climate chaos. The third element of the new times which we've lived through is the apparent evolution and spread of new or evolving pathogens. We've lived through, of course, a new coronavirus, but of course, in the past 15 years, it's not just been COVID-19. We've had SARS, we've also had MERS. And it's only now that the world is finally aware of the threat of new coronavirus variants. There's also, however, been variants of influenza A, including H1N1 and H5N1, the rise of African swine fever in animal populations, and of course, periodic Ebola outbreaks. And then the final element of these new times is the ongoing financial and economic crisis that commenced with the economic crisis that started in 2007, which in my view reinvigorated the austerity agenda that has dominated government economic policy throughout the 21st century. Austerity in 2022 continues to bite, notwithstanding massive government stimulus in the developed countries in the wake of COVID-19, and austerity is on its way back, as witnessed in the proposed tax rises here in the United Kingdom. Austerity, coupled with the rise of modern populism, makes it appear that we're living through what Gramsci called a time of morbid symptoms, as a new socioeconomic order refuses to be born. Now, these 4 elements of the new times are interconnected in a way that might surprise most of you. They're interconnected to food, which places food at the heart of the contemporary political economy of development. So let me take some time and look at how these 4 elements are connected to food. Starting with population. World population dramatically took off after 1800 and even more noticeably after 1950, especially in the developing countries. The UN Population Division estimates that by the end of this century, global population will be just under 11 billion people, although there's actually very good reasons to believe it'll be quite a bit less than that. Now, this begs a key question. Can the world support its current population of almost 8 billion, let alone 11 billion at the end of the century? Can the world's finite resources manage? And more centrally, is the flip side of a world of almost 7 billion people not a world of hunger? The number of hungry people came down by 200 million people over the 20 years between 1995 and 2015, officially. But it's been rising for the past 5 years and is, of course, extensive and exacerbated by the past 2 years. The current estimate of the number of hungry people by the Food and Agriculture Organization places it between 720 and 811 million people in 2020. But even that figure of 811 million people should be challenged, because it's based on the caloric intake needed for a sedentary life. And I myself don't know any poor people who can afford a sedentary life. They have to be active. If we adjust calorie intake upwards to that needed for a physically active life, according to the FAO, the number of hungry in the world goes up to 1.4 billion. And that number has not changed very much at all in 50 years. We live in a world of widespread chronic hunger, and it's a very common, very popular, and I would also say somewhat intuitive belief that population pressures produce hunger, that the food crisis is in some way connected to a growing population. Now, people on this hybrid call and in the room will know that that kind of an argument originates with the Reverend Thomas Malthus in the 18th century. Malthus had a simple argument that food supplies and other resources grow arithmetically, but population grows geometrically. Malthus said, quote, "The power of population is so superior to the power of the earth to produce subsistence for man that premature death must, in some shape, visit the human race." So followers of Malthus believe that at some point population growth has to be faster than the growth of food, causing hunger as a means of reestablishing some kind of balance between food and population. The idea of what we call in the literature food availability decline. And this often implicit belief in food availability decline has produced a widely held view that the current numbers of hungry people are precisely driven by population growth being faster than the growth of food availability. But for population growth to cause increases in hunger and a food crisis, you have to really demonstrate 2 points. The first one is that population growth is greater than increases in food supplies. The second thing that needs to be demonstrated is that increases in food demand are caused by increases in population. So let's look at both. Here, we have increases in per capita food production for the world, for Africa, for South America, and for Asia for the period between 1961 and 2009. I was going to update this, but the most recent data is 2013, and I didn't put the work into doing it. I'll leave it at that. What we see is that for the world as a whole, for Asia and for South America, there is trend increases in per capita food production over the entire period. And in Africa, which is the red line on the graph, you do see a decline in food production per capita up until 1982, but thereafter food production per person goes up, so that by the end of 2009, it's more than it was in 1961. Global calories per person produced per day are more than sufficient to provide adequate amounts of nutrition for everyone on the planet, and have been since 1970. So population growth is not faster than growths in food supplies per person. And according to the World Food Programme, the world already produces enough food to feed 10 billion people. But that leads, I would suggest, to an even more disturbing question. If we have record food production, and make no doubt about it, in 2021, there were record harvests in many parts of the world, if we have record food production, why is there 1.4 billion people hungry if we use the figure necessary for a physically active life? Or why is there 811 million people hungry if we use the calorie intake necessary for a sedentary life? Now, a starting point to answer this is to answer my second question. Is hunger caused by a growing demand for food, which is at least in part driven by growing population? Now, to prefigure what I'm going to say, the answer to this question is that there is a growing demand for food, but that this is not caused by growing population. So what is causing the growing demand for food? There's 3 key reasons for increasing demand for food. The first key reason is biofuels. Between 2000 and 2010, the ethanol industry massively expanded in the developed countries, particularly in the United States and in the European Union. In the United States, the ethanol industry buys about 30% of the corn crop, is very heavily subsidized by the US government in its effort to create a market for a fuel that it produces internally. Now, rising ethanol production diverts food crops into use as fuel, driving up demand for food crops. In the late 2010, some analysts concluded that biofuel production would come down unless cropland would be diverted into fuel production because of the massive expansion of fracking in the United States. But the evidence, in fact, belies this. What we see is a rising demand for edible oils to be converted into biofuels in the United States from the period from 2010. Biofuel production continues to divert potential food supplies into fuel. So that's one element, biofuels. A second element in the growing demand for food is financial speculation. Finance responds to price movements. And as the price of food shot up in 2007 in the wake of the financial crisis in the United States, institutional investors on Wall Street moved into food-based financial contracts in a big way, in a quest to boost their firm's earnings and their own bonuses. The value of assets in food increased, as is seen in the upper left-hand part of this slide. The composition of finance switched from food trading to food speculation, as is seen in the lower panel on the slide. And this spurred price increases, as is seen on the upper right-hand panel of the slide, which looks at price volatility and correlates it with net index positions for a range of commodities. And so when any of those commodities are in the upper right-hand quadrant, there's a positive net index position. They're buying more than they're selling in terms of contracts, and prices are going up. Correlation, not causation, I admit. Agro-commodity-linked financial instruments are now a key investment vehicle for profit-seeking private equity and global banks. A decade ago, Goldman Sachs made $400 million in profit simply by betting on movements in the prices of food staples. And the financialization of food pushes prices higher and makes them more volatile because trading strategies hoard contracts in global food markets where internationally traded food is actually a very small share of total production. And this is done in order to profit from cornering the market for contracts. So the real farm economy and food production has become unhinged from the financialized farm economy and the demand for agri-food commodity contracts, which affects food prices, even as private equity is moving into food in a big way. For example, the sale of Unilever's tea division to CVC, a private equity group. As George Soros, who was a financial speculator, if there ever was one, has said, commodity index buying strategies are, quote, intellectually unsound, potentially destabilizing, and distinctly harmful in their economic consequences. And that's from a speculator. And so the third aspect of increased demand for food that I want to highlight are changing diets and the expanding meatification of diets. Increasingly, the demand for grain is being driven not by the need to feed people, but the need to feed animals used to produce meat to feed people, as people switch from high-starch, low-protein diets to high-protein, low-starch diets, dramatically increasing global meat consumption to well over 40 kilos per person. Poultry production has driven meatification as companies like Tyson industrialize chicken production around the world. Beef production has become a lesser proportion of total meat consumption, but that's something of a side issue because the volume of beef consumption is astronomically high, and beef is the most inefficient way of producing meat protein. You require 8 kilocalories of energy derived from grain to produce only 1 kilocalorie of energy from beef. So the increased demand for food grains is driven by rising demand for meat. Now, there's huge global differences in these volumes. In the US, average meat consumption is 120 kilos per person per year. And in fact, the United States is not the largest consumer of meat in the world. That honor, if you want to call it that, shifts back and forth between Australia and Argentina. In China, around 60 kilos per person of meat is consumed a year. In developing countries as a whole, it's less than 30 kilos per person. In India, it's less than 10 kilos per person. I would argue that at present, it is continually increasing meat demand in the developed countries and the continuing and deepening meatification of our diets that drives the demand for grain. So biofuels, financialization, meatification. Notwithstanding the supply chain issues that have emerged during the course of the pandemic, these are what have driven the increased demand for food by channeling food supplies into less efficient and less effective ways of feeding people. And then this, of course, is compounded by the extent of food that is wasted and by climate change. Global agriculture in many ways is uniquely exposed to climate change in terms of both the individual extreme weather events and long-term shifts in climatic patterns. Global agriculture faces far more risks from climate change than opportunities. And so recently, coffee prices, potato prices, and yellow pea prices, like many other agricultural commodity prices, have been impacted by climate change. What climate change has done has exacerbated rises that were already underway, as you see in the figure. But nonetheless, the demand for food is not driven by population growth. The rising demand for food grains and the diversion of those food grains into not directly feeding people, this has been driven by the globalization of the world food system. The contemporary world food system is clearly and uniquely capitalist. It's dominated by global agri-food transnational corporations. And these corporations are driven by financial imperatives of short-run profitability. The contemporary food system is characterized by relentless food commodification and the supermarket revolution, as well as increasing oligopolization in agrochemicals, food trade, and food manufacturing. At the point of production, the dominant model of the capitalist world food system is the fossil fuel-driven, large-scale, linear flow-through, capital-intensive, industrial agricultural megafarm. These capital-intensive megafarms have torn us under a 10,000-year history of closed-loop regenerative farming systems. It's a system which uses information technologies and historically unsurpassed logistical capabilities. It uses transgenic organisms to forge global animal protein supply chains based upon the globalization of confined animal feeding operations, which fosters the meatification of diets. It's predicated on and requires the massive use of hydrocarbons. It supplies mass-produced, standardized, and highly durable processed food based upon soy and high fructose corn syrup for the global middle classes. This so-called Fordist food has gross profit margins of around 20%, and therefore companies rely on shifting food in large volumes. But this food system also supplies so-called healthy, so-called fresh, so-called organic foods for the global upper classes. The standardized differentiation of this so-called post-Fordist food has gross margins of around 40%. This food regime is sustained by governments, international institutions, and big philanthropy. It bypasses the needs of the food insecure, while at the same time generating low-paying work for billions of people. There's 5 points that I want to stress about the capitalist world food system. This slide is a simplified global agri-food commodity chain, which was developed by Joachim von Braun in 2007 in light of the last food price crisis. Von Braun has never updated it. I've asked him why he hasn't. He just hasn't done it. In 2007, the world food economy was worth about $4 trillion. Today, it's worth about $8 trillion, but the distribution of value across the chain has not significantly shifted. Hence, I show you this slide. The first point then is that the world food system is one in which specific actors are able to exert exceedingly strong power over the entire system. In this instance, supermarkets, which in 2007, just as today, capture around 1/4 of all the value produced in the system. So in 2007, it was 1/4 of 4 trillion, and now it's 1/4 of 8 trillion. So the choice that we witness emerging out of the world food system is one that is embedded within strongly oligopolistic companies that use their market power to roll prices back. This is done to the supposed benefit of the eater, but in reality is done for the benefit of the corporate bottom line. And this was strongly demonstrated during the last global food price crisis between 2007 and 2011. So here we have the net profits of Walmart and Tesco, American and British, between 2006 and 2012. I grant that Walmart and Tesco do not solely sell food, but Walmart, for example, for every $2 spent on food in the United States, $1 is spent at a Walmart. So they are a massive food retailer. They had a pretty good food price crisis. Just as with Walmart and Tesco, a number of agri-food transnationals involved in food trading, Archer Daniels Midland, Bunge, and Cargill, had a very good food price crisis. Just as with Walmart and food trading, food processors had a very good food price crisis. So across the global agri-food value chain, agri-food transnationals had a good crisis. If we want to identify the missing link between record hunger, record production, and record prices now, the link is record profits. Gross margins of 20% associated with the processed food, the Fortis food sold in supermarkets, as I've said, means that they must shift large volumes of product. And this then is the second point I want to make about the current capitalist world food system. Eaters are consuming large volumes of so-called bad sugars, and particularly high fructose corn syrup, as the rise in obesity strongly correlates with the rise in energy intake. The result of this is a global obesity crisis, which, because of its health effects, places a huge burden on the global economy. Estimates from a decade ago indicate that obesity had the same impact on the global economy as efforts to combat armed violence and the war on terror. Think about it. Researchers argue that more people die for every year from diet-related diseases than die from hunger. And if we add the hungry and the obese together, 7 out of every 10 people in the world are malnourished, which is, I think, a fairly strong indictment of the way in which the contemporary food system operates. The third point about the contemporary food system I want to stress is that many of the new pathogens that we face, including SARS-CoV-2, are a direct consequence of the industrialization of the food system, and in particular, the bringing together of people with animals in unprecedented numbers in close conditions. Coronavirus has jumped from animals to human. Avian flu can jump from animal to human, and then human-to-human transmission can begin. Industrial livestock production that flows from meatification in particular breeds its own diseases, like swine flu and avian flu, in concentrated confined animal feeding operations and on factory farms. These farming methods significantly enhance the virulence of the viruses that emerge from factory farm pigs and poultry, among others, before they cross from animal to human. And that's because modern animal farming significantly weakens the resistance of animals to pathogens, even as the massive application of antibiotics to combat pathogens in animals contributes to antibiotic resistance, cumulatively exacerbating the problem of new pathogens. The fourth point I want to make about the contemporary food system is that, as the International Panel on Climate Change has stressed, the contemporary food system is based upon a model of production, distribution, and consumption that, in its hydrocarbon dependence and greenhouse gas emissions, significantly worsens climate crisis and degrades the ecological foundations of the very farm production upon which it depends. So food crisis is linked to climate crisis. In 2007 and 2008, the IPCC estimated that around a quarter of all greenhouse gas emissions could be linked to agriculture. But for COP26 last year, the FAO did a re-estimate and found that this had actually increased from a quarter to 31% of all greenhouse gas emissions emerging from the agri-food sector. If we add it all up, global food production emits a higher share of its profits as environmental costs than global oil and gas, which is really quite remarkable. And meatification, as I've suggested, is especially implicated here. Beef and pig production contributes more than 7% of all greenhouse gas emissions. As Tony Weiss so eloquently puts it, the corporate food system has a massive ecological footprint which is getting bigger. So as I said, food provides a missing link between population and hunger, economic crisis, the emergence of new pathogens, and ecological crisis. The fourth point I want to make, was it 4 or was it 5 points? I think there's actually only 4, not 5. The final point I want to make is that in the mid-1990s, the world market prices that had started to emerge in the late 19th century were consolidated for agricultural products with the Agreement on Agriculture. This means that smallholder farmers around the world face prices that never reflect their costs of production because prices are never set locally. Smallholder farmers are unable to compete against the subsidized exports of the United States and the European Union, who dump food onto world markets, as small-scale farmers face a simple reproduction squeeze in which they cannot cover their costs of production. And this generates a deepening global agrarian crisis for smallholder farmers. The global agrarian crisis is a good part of the reason why 3/4 of the global food insecure live in the countryside, spend at least part of their time working the land, and are increasingly women. They're hungry because they cannot compete on the basis of world market prices. As a result, around the world, debt-ridden farmers are forced to give up their livelihoods and leave the land if they don't kill themselves, which increasing numbers of them do. And when they give up their livelihoods, they form in effect what Marx called a relative surplus population as the planet of slums expand. In Asia, those who have not exited as a consequence of the global agrarian crisis have responded to it in one of 2 ways. For some small-scale farmers, they've moved. They've moved because of their marginalization by increasingly industrial agricultural methods. They move to less cultivable, often forested areas where they encroach on wilder habitats, putting in place a possible, and I stress possible, channel through which animal viruses can be transmitted to humans as forest disease dynamics enter peri-urban settings. Secondly, some small-scale farmers have diversified production into more lucrative, higher value products that, when commodified, can be more easily sold in nearby markets. For livestock farmers marginalized by industrial livestock production, one group of these higher value products are animals that were once caught and eaten for subsistence from the wild, and which have not traditionally been bred in captivity to be sold as food. I'm thinking here of snakes, beavers, turtles, porcupines, baby crocodiles, mallard ducks, and pangolins, among others. For these small-scale livestock farmers, agrarian crisis has forced them to produce such commodities for niche markets in which they can realize more value. These commodities can then be supplemented by, again, higher value domesticated animals that are not traditionally eaten as food, but for which a food market exists. For example, dogs and cats. This expansion into more niche markets of higher value is the very logic of the market imperatives of the world food system. Yet the commodification of farm-raised so-called wild animals who were raised in captivity can also create the opportunity for pathogens to cross from non-traditional farmed animals to livestock, and from there to humans. And indeed, when farmers raising non-traditional farmed animals are successful in exploiting the opportunities afforded by markets, this creates incentives to increase the scale of their activity amplifying the possibility of zoonotic transmission. So again, the structure of the capitalist food system on a world scale sustains the accelerated emergence of pathogens. Cumulatively, the hunger that we see in the world food system is produced because the world food system has been constructed to bypass a significant number of those that cannot compete in globalized farming or have been driven off the land and work in poorly paid, insecure, and frequently dangerous informal work. In 2021, in circumstances that didn't exist when I started my undergraduate degree, the global hungry access food not by producing food, but by using money in food markets. And this is precisely what the hungry of the planet lack. No money and you are hungry, whether you're in Manchester, Mogadishu, or Medellin. And so the hungry are denied entitlements to food as a result of the normal, routine, and everyday working of a world food system that creates systemic hunger by excluding a significant proportion of the world's population. So the hunger that we see is not about scarcity, it's about economics. But it has to be stressed that this is a violation of the fundamental individual and collective human rights of eaters and farmers, as laid out in the 1948 United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So we need to construct a new food system that ensures a right to food. Access to adequate, sufficient, safe, sustainable, and culturally appropriate food should be available to everyone as a basic right of citizenship. So what type of food system needs to be constructed? There's two falsehoods which lie at the heart of our contemporary world food system. The first one, that we have to have capital-intensive industrial agriculture. The second one, we need that to feed the world of 11 billion. Vandana Shiva, however, puts it thusly. It's not industrial agriculture that feeds the world, it's the earth, it's the pollinators, and it's the small-scale petty commodity producing farmers, the very ones who are threatened by industrial agriculture. They're the ones that feed the world. So can smaller scale farming feed a world of 11 billion people? There have been countless scientific studies that have been done in this century that suggest that a different farming system called agroecology can be as or more productive and as or more profitable than industrial agriculture. Okay? I paid particularly attention to studies in 2001 by Jules Preddy and Rachel Hine, and then Preddy's follow-up in 2006, which directly compared productivity levels between conventional resource extracting industrial agricultural methods versus resource conserving agroecological farming methods. Both studies employed research that covered millions of data points, 3% of the world's arable area. And what we saw, for example, from 2006 is that in every instance of the 208 projects that Preddy studied of farmers transitioning into more agroecological farming systems, in all but 3 of them, 205 out of 208, crop yields went up as farmers transition. I would suggest that it is possible to feed the world agroecologically, but going into that in detail is for another seminar. We need to facilitate the deepening and widening of agroecological farming practices in order to stop climate change and the ecological destruction of the biophysical resources upon which farming depends. Agroecology requires optimizing the sustainable use of low-impact local resources while minimizing the use of high-impact farm technologies in order to sustain soils and the micronutrients embedded in the soils. And so agroecology adapts farm input and output choices to reflect the ecosystem and the landscape, while at the same time sustaining and seeking to enhance crop yields so as to increase agricultural surpluses. We need to foster agroecology because it is more resilient to environmental, no, wrong one. It is more resilient to economic and environmental shocks. It's more labor intensive. Historically, more agroecological farming systems were the foundation of local communities and localized food systems, which through asymmetrical mechanisms of social reciprocity ensured adequate, nutritious, and culturally appropriate food for all. A right to food that was not based upon money, but based upon the membership of a community. And finally, as I've said, agroecology cools the planet. We can build a food system that sustains the ecology of the planet and meets the challenge of a growing population. We can build a food system that sustains a global right to food, that mitigates climate change, which sustains a living livelihood for billions, and which addresses the structural tendencies towards deepening social inequalities generated by the world economy. We can do this by building food systems based around something that can be called food sovereignty. Food sovereignty is based on the rights of peoples and countries to define their own agricultural and food policy. Firstly, and most importantly, it's based upon the right of farmers to produce food and receive prices for that food that they produce that reflects their actual costs of production, not world market prices. Food sovereignty, however, is also based upon the right of eaters to have much more information about what it is they are consuming and who is producing what it is they are consuming. Because most eaters know very little about where their food comes from. So these two rights means that the rights of peoples and countries would be to decide over how and by whom food is produced and consumed. It would require the protection of both consumers and farmers from international food dumping that arises out of agricultural export subsidies. And so food sovereignty requires the protection of national agriculture from low-priced imports. Food sovereignty also calls for the phasing out of government measures that promote unsustainable agriculture and the redirection of government support to smaller scale sustainable farming systems. Currently, only about 1% of global agricultural research is devoted to agroecology and sustainable food systems. The rest is all going into industrial agriculture. So food sovereignty is the movement for a new food system. So that brings me to the end. Now, if you found this talk interesting in some way, you could, and if you're interested in learning about more, you could take a look at my podcast, The World Food System. And I look forward then to your questions. Rob has asked me to put the final slide on, which is an announcement for next week's Global Development Seminar. So I'll leave it at that.